Hey there, self-care warriors. Welcome back to Self-Care Haven. I realized in my last video I didn't really mention or emphasize the fact that my book is released. So it was released on April 23rd, and it was actually number one, again, in personality disorders in the bestsellers list. And it was also number two in two other categories. So thank you so much for your support of the book. And thank you for those who reviewed the book, and thank you for all those who contributed to the book, whether you contributed an article or whether you contributed by submitting your survey response. I'm so honored and so grateful, and I hope you check out the book. It's one of the most comprehensive things I've ever read in my life, and it's about well over 300 pages. So I've tried to make it as much of a Bible that I can on narcissistic abuse, so I hope you'll check it out. But I did want to revisit a topic in an earlier video called Your Brain on Love, Sex, and the Narcissist, and I talked a little bit briefly about the biochemical bonds that we develop with our abusers, but I never really went into them, so I thought I'd do this topic a little bit more justice by revisiting it in a new video. And it's very timely, actually, because with the release of the book does have a chapter, a whole chapter dedicated to your brain on trauma, your brain on love, sex, and the narcissist. And I wanted to go briefly into the history of this article and how it became an ebook, and then shortly after went into my new comprehensive book. So when I first came to the survivor community, I had always thought of abuse survivors as really like strong warriors, people who had gone through a lot, and I knew that they were physiologically, psychologically, and physically bonded to their abusers. I had heard of Stockholm Syndrome, and then I was reintroduced to this idea of trauma bonding, which is very much like Stockholm Syndrome. You tend to bond with the person who's hurting you, and you're doing this because you have this betrayal bond, or as Patrick Carnes calls it, this betrayal bond that basically is a shared intense experience with your abuser. And I had learned about what Melanie Tonia Evans had called peptide addiction, and I didn't understand what she meant by that, so I decided, let me look up what are the actual chemicals and hormones that bond us in healthy relationships. I already knew oxytocin and dopamine were two of the culprits, but how does that look in a relationship that is unhealthy, toxic, and narcissistic? So that's when the article Your Brain on Love, Sex, and the Narcissist was born, and I decided to kind of research each chemical and hormone that I was interested in and see what is the impact of that, especially if you're in a toxic, dysfunctional relationship with a lot of traumatic highs and lows. And what I discovered was that our brain's biochemistry is not on our side, because it does not enable us to really even want to leave our partners. Actually, a dysfunctional relationship and the intermittent reinforcement involved in that allows all of these hormones and chemicals to bond us even more strongly to our abusers. So I wanted to go into a little bit of the research on that, and it's also very timely because this article was recently adapted on Your Tango, which is a platform for articles about love and relationships. And the new title is, I want to share this with you because I think it's very on point. It's called 4 Scary Ways Your Brain is Tricking You into Loving Your Abuser. I think that's really on point. So I'm going to go into this, and I'll also add information from the original article as well, but this has been adapted to their platform. So the article starts off by saying, leaving is never easy. Many survivors of narcissistic abuse are confounded by the addiction they feel to the narcissist long after the abusive relationship is over. Recovery from an abusive relationship can be very similar to withdrawal from a drug addiction due to the biochemical bonds we may develop with our toxic ex-partners. Understanding why we are addicted lets us recognize that our addiction is not about the merits of the narcissist, but rather the nature and the severity of the trauma we've experienced in this abusive relationship. This information enables us to detach and move forward with the powerful knowledge that can propel us towards healthier relationships and healthier bonds. The information about the effects of a toxic relationship on our brain challenges the victim-blaming discourse in society that prevents many abuse survivors from gaining support and validation for the traumas they've experienced that have tethered them to their abusers. Survivors may suffer many relapses on the road to recovery from the relationship. So I'll explore how our own brain chemistry can lock us into this addiction to the narcissistic or sociopathic partner. Here are some brain chemicals that can make it very difficult for survivors to detach from narcissistic partners. Number 1, oxytocin. Oxytocin, aka the cuddle or love hormone, is released during touching, orgasm, and sexual intercourse. It promotes attachment and trust. In fact, it's the same hormone released by the hypothalamus to bond a mother and child at birth. During love bombing and mirroring in the idealization phase with our abusive partners, it's likely that our bond to them is quite strong as a result of this hormone. Many survivors reminisce about the electrifying sexual chemistry they had with their narcissistic partners, one that they feel unable to achieve with future partners. This chemistry exists because charming emotional predators like narcissists and sociopaths are able to mirror our deepest sexual and emotional desires. And this leads to a strong sexual bond, which in turn releases oxytocin and creates a greater amount of attachment and trust to the narcissist. So even when the narcissist is engaging in really duplicitous behavior, deceptive behavior, we are still releasing oxytocin when we bond with them physically. And when we bond with them physically, we're releasing that hormone that makes us trust them in spite of the fact that they are deceiving us. Meanwhile, the narcissist, who is typically devoid of empathy and does not form these types of close attachments, is able to move forward onto his or her next partner, and this is done without much thought or remorse. The addictive nature of oxytocin is also gendered according to the book The Chemistry of a Connection. Because estrogen promotes the effects of oxytocin bonding, whereas testosterone discourages it, this makes it theoretically more difficult for females in any type of relationship to detach from the bond as quickly as men. The second brain chemical that I want to talk about is dopamine. Now, this is the same neurotransmitter that is responsible for cocaine addiction. And actually, Dr. Helen Fisher discovered that there's actually a similar brain activation in the brains of individuals who have love relationships filled with adversity as there are in people addicted to cocaine. And pleasurable, intense memories trigger dopamine. So when we're reminiscing about the pleasurable moments in the idealization phase with a toxic partner, what's happening? Those reward circuits are being reinforced. And these reward circuits being created by those positive memories are basically telling the brain to do it again. So, do you remember recalling the pleasurable, beautiful first moments with your narcissistic partner even after you'd broken up? The romantic dates, the sweet compliments, the praise, the incredible sex. That's the dopamine talking. And the salience theory of dopamine suggests that our brain releases dopamine not just for pleasurable events. It actually releases dopamine for important ones linked to survival. As Samantha Smithstein puts it, dopamine is not just a messenger that dictates what feels good. It also tells the brain what is important and what to pay attention to in order to survive. And the more powerful the experience is, the stronger the message is to the brain to repeat the activity for survival. So note that it says the more powerful an experience is. That means whether the experience is bad or good does not necessarily matter when it comes to dopamine. Of course, the pleasurable moments do strengthen the reward circuit, but the stronger and more powerful that experience is. So it could be a very powerfully good experience that's also tainted with a negative insult, a harsh remark, and some sort of intermittent reinforcement of abuse that's periodically dispersed throughout the abuse cycle, along with these sweet moments of bliss. And that combination is a deadly combination, because studies show that dopamine flows more readily when rewards are given out on an unpredictable schedule rather than predictably after conditioned cues. So let's talk about this. So again, intermittent reinforcement. When we talk about intermittent reinforcement, this was coined by a psychologist known as B.F. Skinner. And this is when the abusive partner is able to get away with the abuse by providing occasional positive rewards along with their mistreatment. And that leaves the victim wanting to continue to invest and invest, just like a gambler at a slot machine, hoping to go back to that idealization phase. And what does that intermittent reinforcement schedule do? It actually allows the dopamine to flow more readily in the brain. So it's actually creating stronger reward circuits in the brain associated with your toxic partner when he or she doles out these sweet moments along with the abuse. So the random sweet nothings whispered to us after an incident of emotional abuse, the apologies, the pity ploys, the rare displays of tenderness during the devaluation phase, right before another incident of abuse, actually help to cement this type of reward circuit rather than hinder it. Combine this with the powerful experiences of abuse, which alert our brain to pay attention, as well as the pleasurable memories we recollect over and over and over again. And what do we have? We have a biochemical bond from hell. Alright, so let's talk about the third set of chemicals, which is cortisol, adrenaline, and norepinephrine. And these work together to make you an adrenaline junkie. So cortisol is a stress hormone, and as you know, in an abusive relationship, it's going to get released during the traumatic highs and lows. It's released by the adrenal glands in response to fear. So, of course, we're going to be walking on eggshells around our abusers. It's going to evoke a lot of fear in our bodies, and it's going to evoke the fight or flight response. And since we're unlikely to have a physical outlet of release when cortisol is triggered, this often traps the stress within our bodies instead. And as we ruminate over the incidents of abuse, increased levels of cortisol leads to more and more health problems. Christopher Berglund, who talks a lot about cortisol and the effects of adrenaline, suggests numerous ways to counteract the effects of this hormone, which include physical activity, mindfulness, meditation, laughter, music, and social connectivity. Adrenaline and norepinephrine also prepare our body for the fight or flight response, and they're also culprits in the biochemical reactions to our abusers. Adrenaline actually promotes an antidepressant effect, triggering fear and anxiety, which then again releases dopamine. And this can cause us to become adrenaline junkies, addicted to the rush of vacillating between bonding and betrayal. Withdrawal from that rush can be incredibly painful, which is why so many survivors of narcissistic abuse actually struggle so much with no contact. Now let's talk about serotonin. Serotonin is a hormone that regulates mood. When we fall in love, the serotonin levels in our body fall in a way that mimics the way that they're lowered in individuals with obsessive compulsive disorder. So someone in love basically acts like someone with OCD. This may come to no surprise to individuals who have been groomed early on in a toxic relationship, who are basically conditioned to expect excessive praise and flattery from a charming and emotional predator, because individuals with low levels of serotonin are also more likely to engage in sexual behavior. And then that again releases dopamine and oxytocin. This is like a cycle. These chemicals interact with each other. They strengthen these bonds. In fact, cortisol and oxytocin actually work together to create and consolidate fear-based memories. So again, all of these chemicals and hormones are working together. They're working together to create and cement this form of reward circuit, this form of bonding with our abuser that's very difficult to extricate ourselves from. And this is why narcissistic abusers dominate our brains, especially in the early idealization phases of the relationship, but also in the devaluation phase. Because we're made to think about our narcissistic partner 24/7, whether it's through fear or through love. And then the last bond that I want to talk about is not necessarily a biochemical bond, but a psychological and emotional one that is basically cemented by all these other biochemical bonds, and that's called trauma bonding. Patrick Carnes mentions trauma bonding, or what he calls betrayal bonding, as a type of bond that is created when we have an intense shared experience with our abuser. It's part of the larger phenomenon known as Stockholm Syndrome. And trauma bonding occurs after these intense emotional experiences with our abusers and tethers us to them, creating these subconscious patterns of attachment that are very difficult to get away from. Trauma bonding is prevalent in abusive relationships, as well as kidnapping, hostage situations, and even addiction. According to Patrick Carnes, little acts of degradation, manipulation, secrecy, and shame on a daily basis take their toll. Trauma, by its accumulation, sneaks up on its victims. These daily acts of degradation, of stonewalling, of projection, gaslighting, verbal abuse, triangulation, and manipulation are the exact ingredients that cumulatively create the insidious and covert abuse inflicted upon us by our narcissistic abusers. Narcissistic abusers create this constant, chronic environment of fear, of shame, of control, in which victims are left constantly walking on eggshells, waiting for the other shoe to drop. They are betrayed emotionally, spiritually, and physically by their partners every day, by their condescending remarks, their infidelity, their pathological lies, their put-downs, their name-calling, and even physical abuse. And although survivors of narcissistic abuse can come from many different backgrounds, and anyone can theoretically become a victim, trauma bonding is even more significant for those who grow up in a violent or emotionally abusive home, and or have had a narcissistically abusive parent in addition to their most recent experiences with narcissistic abuse. Survivors of multiple incidents of abuse by various narcissistic individuals can further reinforce subconscious wounds that they experienced in childhood in the trauma bond with their current abusers. If there has been victimization in the past, such as the experience of having to survive an abusive household, this can lead to a type of trauma repetition or reenactment. So as you can see, we're both psychologically and biochemically bonded to our abusers. And if you want to learn more about these biochemical bonds, I do take a very extensive look into each and every one of these chemicals and hormones in my second chapter of the book. And I urge you to check it out because I also discuss how to combat all of these biochemical bonds in my book. And I will leave the links to the articles below in case you want to look at it and share it. It is a more brief version of what I discuss in my book, but it can still be very helpful to understanding why this addiction has occurred, why we tend to relapse, and why it's so difficult to extricate ourselves from a narcissistic abuser and to really stop ruminating over those incidents of narcissistic abuse. I hope that you enjoyed this video. I hope you found it empowering. I hope you found it informative. Let me know your thoughts below. How did you feel addicted to your narcissistic abuser? Did you relapse during the no contact journey? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, so please be sure to leave a comment below, share this video with others, and until then, take care.